This tutorial is part of our full stack React Django DRF channels project, DJ Chat. You can watch this tutorial and many more from our YouTube course playlist, or the whole course, including access to additional resources from our Udemy course. The Udemy course link, which provides the best price for the course, is in the video description. So CRUD is a very popular acronym that stands for Create, Return, Update, and Delete. So describing the very popular common operations that we perform when, in this case, returning data from our API. Now, I will be calling CRUD, or at least the R in CRUD. Normally, I refer that to return, because typically what you're doing here is you're returning data as an action rather than reading data. Read suggests that you're just not necessarily returning any data from the database. So I use the terminology return instead of read for the R in CRUD. So like I said, it represents the four basic operations that can be performed on data in most database systems, for example. So each operation corresponds to a specific action. So what we're going to be doing here then is building our own React hook. So this hook is going to provide all the functionality to perform these type of functions or these operations, in our application. So we're going to centralize these operations in one place so that we can reuse this code whenever we want to perform an operation such as create, read or return, update or delete. Now, I don't think I've introduced hooks before. So in React, a hook is a special function that's going to allow us to add state and other React features to functional components. So hooks, I think hooks were introduced in React around about 16.7, 16.8 as a way of reusing stateful logic without the need for class components. So essentially removing class components or the steering towards the idea of moving away from class components. So if you're new to React and you're familiar with object-oriented programming, you could think of a hook as a class. So it's going to provide the behaviors, the components, features, functions, that a class does. And that then provides us a reusable set of code, which we can then utilize in other components. So that's essentially what hook is going to provide us, a way of creating some reusable code, which we can then use in other components. Now, we have already utilized some hooks in that React provides a set of built-in hooks that we can use out of the box. So we've already utilized, for example, useState, useEffect, I think, and we've also utilized in the previous, we utilized something else, which I can't remember, but we've utilized a few built-in hooks already. So here we're going to build our own hook, which we're going to, like I said, utilize as a central place for us to perform operations, create, return, update, and delete on our backend API. Right, so let's go ahead and get started. Now we're going to create a new folder. Unsurprisingly, we're going to call this folder hooks. This is where we're going to store or place all of our custom hooks. So let's create a new file. Now hooks normally start, general convention is to start the hook name with use, and then this is going to be CRUD. So it's going to be TypeScript. Right, so we're going to build a hook which is going to perform a number of different operations, create, return, update, and delete. So we're going to start with just returning data or reading data from the database. Now, as this hook is going to be responsible for actually creating requests, we are going to need to import the interceptor. Remember, we're going to pass everything through the interceptor. So let's import that in first. And then we're also going to need to import the base URL. We can utilize that here. And then, of course, we extend that based upon the type of request that we want to send, utilizing the backend filter we created. Okay. And let's get started. So let's create a new hook called use CRUD. Okay. That's going to be exported, of course. So let's go ahead and set the default. And then we're going to need some sort of return. There we go. Okay, so let's bring in the JWT Axios equals use interceptor. Going to need that, like if you saw the previous example where we utilize the interceptor, we need to set that up. And then in addition to that, right, so what we're doing here then, let's have a little think, an explanation. So eventually this is going to be utilized on a component. So we're going to build, for example, a component that's going to be utilized in the home page. So let's remind ourselves the fact that we've built a template system. So at the moment, we don't have this data that you can see here. We've got to this point here at the moment. We don't have any data. So this is just a template. So what we're going to be building are components that are going to be utilized in these spaces. Now, these components are going to be the components that are going to be utilizing the CRUD hook. Right, so that's the first thing we need to have in our mind. So the components that we're going to be utilizing are going to be reusing these features, these functions that we're going to be creating in the use CRUD hook. So this hook is providing functionality. So we're going to need to return that functionality to the component or make it available for them to actually utilize. So what we're going to do first then is we're going to be building a fetch data component or feature so that we can then return that back to the component so it can be utilized when it utilizes this hook. So the idea here then, roughly speaking, is that we're going to create a new function here. Let's just call that fetch data. And then what we do here is we then need to, actually we don't need, then what we do here, apologies, then what we do here is we actually return this. So we add some kind of logic here eventually in a couple of seconds. We'll go ahead and add some logic here. And that's going to be the logic that's actually going to send a request. Obviously, it's going to be utilizing the interceptor, but we want to actually be able to utilize this on other components. So we need to pass that and actually then return that. So what's going to happen in another component that we build, that's going to utilize this hook and then utilize this function through this hook. So essentially what we're building here, I'm just trying to break this down to get a general idea. In this hook is providing different features that we're going to pass to components and utilize. Not just features, it might also be different states that we need to create. Obviously, by doing that, we're just writing this code once. So then we're just going to reutilize this code on multiple components whenever needed. Now, something that I'm going to try and touch upon and avoid at the same time is working with Axios asynchronously, or thinking about asynchronous code. Now, Axios get that we're utilizing at the moment, this method is not inherently asynchronous. However, you can use it within an asynchronous function and utilize the await keyword to wait for the response from the server. So, it's not necessary for us to use async keyword with Axios library itself. The Axios library provides a promise-based API. Again, something else to look into if you're new to React and JavaScript, looking into promise-based APIs, which mean you can use it with or without the async await syntax. So it's going to be up to you, your particular style and approach, whether you want to use this or not. I'm probably going to mix it up a little bit here in the code and talk a little bit about both. Now, by utilizing asynchronous approaches, using the async keyword, within the function and await, it means that we can handle the response data within a try block and catch any errors that may occur within the catch block. So let's go ahead and just convert our fetch data function. So this is going to equal async. So fetch data async, yep. And now what we can do is set out the try catch block. So try and catch. So we want to catch any errors. So let's just define that type as any. So now we can go ahead and build a request. So we want to build a request. So we're trying to now compose an Axios request to the API server, axios.get. So we're going to return some data, and that's going to be, so we just need to set this up. So we need to specify, actually we don't need that. Let's specify the base URL and space URL. So we've got the base URL. We set that up. So base URL, and then in addition to that, just extend that to include the API URL. So this is going to be the URL that we're going to set in the component and pass along. So API URL. A little bit later in this course, we'll need to send some additional information. So we'll just set that up for now. We won't need to pass anything in. Finish that off. I might finishing that off because I'm missing something. I've done it wrong. That's why. Okay, so inside of here, we'll just add a placeholder for something we'll add later. So that's the response. So let's go ahead and now capture the response. So after that, we go ahead and we don't need to catch just yet. So let's go ahead and set some data. So what we're going to need to do now is store the data that's returned somewhere. So we're going to need to set up a state for that. So let's go ahead and do that. So let's just call this data CRUD, or CRUD, however you like to. I'm just going to use capitals, data CRUD, and then set data CRUD. That's going to be a use state. So we're going to need to set up, this is TypeScript, so we're going to need to set up an interface and define this shortly. So we're going to just set this as a T, and we'll do that shortly. And then let's set some initial data. Now remember, what's happening here is that we are utilizing this function on a different component. And as we've just specified here, we need to pass in to this function the API URL that we're going to be utilizing in the component. So the components are going to be specifying different URLs we want to get data from. So we need to pass that in. So let's just update the use CRUD here. So equals, that's going to be T, and then we set the initial data. Initial data, that's going to be T. So set that up shortly. And then after that, we need to just specify the fact that we want to pass in the API URL. That's going to be a string. And then we can also then specify the interface, which is I use CRUD. We'll just sort that out shortly. Okay, right, so let's now build our interface. So define all the types. So we're going to build an interface. I use CRUD T. Let's go ahead and set data CRUD. So that's going to be empty. We're then going to specify fetch data function. So that's a function promise and void. Okay. Then in addition to that, let's just finish this off with the use state. So we're going to import use state. That's from React. Okay. Okay, so while you're typing that, I'll just quickly explain what's happening here. Right, so up the top here then, we've declared an interface named IUseCRUD. Okay, so the I referring to an interface, that type of standard. I think we've mentioned that before, potentially. So when naming an interface, sometimes it can be common practice to use an I in front of the name. So obviously useCRUD refers to the hook useCRUD. Right, so this has a generic type parameter T. Okay, the interface defines two parameters, which is data CRUD, which has an array of type T, empty, and also the fetch data function, which returns a promise with no return value. So then we've gone ahead and we've created our use CRUD function here. Now you notice that we've added some additionality here. So what we have here then, so this line then declares the function named use CRUD. So we know that it has two parameters. So those two parameters being the initial data, okay, which is the array type of T representing the initial data. So there's no initial data. So it's empty to begin with. And then also the API URL, which is what we're going to pass into it. And that's going to be the URL that the component is going to be utilizing to access the data from the API. We've then gone ahead and we've created a new state. So notice that to set data in the state, we're going to use set data CRUD. And then to access data from this state, we're going to use data CRUD. And notice that by default, the initial state of it is empty. And then we created our new function inside, which we're then going to pass to the component so it can utilize. So you can see here that what we're trying to do here is build an Axios request. But remember, we're utilizing the functionality of our interceptor to actually run that request and return or to capture any errors through our interceptor. So we're sending our request, remember, through the interceptor, if you like. And then we're using the base URL and the URL that's passed into the function to actually build the URL of the request that we want to, or the request URL that we want to access data, or where we want to access data. So that's going to be the URL. I've made that sound really complicated. This is just going to be the URL of where the data is in our API. So here we're just constructing the request URL like we've done here. Now, so far we have the ability to catch any errors. Obviously, there's nothing here at the moment, but we've got that ability. So what we want to do here now then is to, if there is any data returning in the response, we want to obviously now load up the data CRUD state here. We want to store it there in that state. So let's go ahead and do that. So we're just going to say set data CRUD. That's going to then equal the data. So actually, let's just grab that data. So let's say const data equals response dot data, and then let's say set data CRUD with data. Okay, there we go. Right, so potentially what we're going to need to do This is where it gets a little bit more complicated initially. It's hard to make a flow here. But potentially what we're going to need to do is handle any errors. Now, what we need to remember is this is just a generic piece of code that we're going to use anytime we want to build a request. Now, typically when we build a request, potentially there's going to be errors. So we need to handle those errors, not only in the interceptor sometimes, but sometimes on the actual in the actual application. So potentially we want to pass that information back as well to our component that utilizes this functionality. So what we're going to do here is we're going to set up another constant, or another state here to store that data. So we're going to call this error and then set error. So that's going to be use state. So we're going to store in here then the error. The initial data is going to be just null, and then we just need to set up our interface here. So we're going to specify type for error, so error or null. Okay, right, so that's the error. So what we can do here in actual fact now is we can specify the fact that set error, apologies, what happened there? Set error. So we're going to set that to there we go. Set that to null. Now, what we might also want to do here is that there might be a delay between sending the request to the server and actually retrieving the data. So what we might want to do is define some sort of loading state so that while we're waiting for the data to be returned from the server, maybe some sort of loading icon or some sort of loading screen is shown. So we want to be able to set that up too. So we're going to create a new state for that. So is loading. So set is loading. So let's do that. So use state. Let's set this to the initial state to false. So it's not loading. So what we want to do here then, as soon as we run this request to set up or to grab some data, return data from the database, let's set is loading. Let's set that to true. So if you think about the flow top to bottom, first of all, we send a request from the component. The component utilizes this function here. And then first thing we need to do is set loading to true. It means that we're just about to send a request to the server to get some data. Now, as soon as we've got that data and we've returned that data, what we probably need to do, once we've defined the fact that the error is null, so we haven't returned an error, we returned some data. Let's now set is loading to false. So we start off by setting the loading to true, so it is loading. Now that can be read by the component and serve some sort of loading screen or icon. And then as soon as we return the data here, you can see we then set that to false, indicating that the data has now been returned. So let's go ahead now and return. We want to return the data. So what we can do now is capture some errors. So for example, if for example, error.response, so what we're doing is we're grabbing the error message and we're just delving into that. Now you can do here, if you wanted to, a console.log on error to actually have a look at the data. So let's say if error.response, so if there is an error and error.response, response status, so we can grab the status of that response. If that equals 400, then let's go ahead and do something special. Let's go ahead and set the error in the state to this information. So new error 400. Okay, so what we've done there is if we receive the 400 status return, then what's going to happen is, actually, what's going on here? So we just need to wrap that up. There we go. I think that's about right. So we just need to wrap that up. So if we do return an error, we're just going to capture that 400 error. Then we're just going to set that in the error state, and then that can be also be passed back to the component, and then we can perform some sort of action. Now, what we also need to do is to remember that we set loading to true. Now, if we have captured an error, then the set loading to false will not be initiated. It will simply just go on to the catch here. So we also need to make sure that after this here, we actually set, let's just get this in the right place. We need to set the is loading to false here. Okay. In addition to that, we probably need to also throw, like we saw previously, the error, and that would then return or propagate it back to the caller, this information, to avoid any loops. Now you notice here that the return, there seems to be an issue here, and that's because we're missing some property. So remember, this is what we're returning back. So remember, the component is going to be utilizing this. Apologies if I'm just embellishing and repeating myself, but the component is going to be utilizing this hook. That's what these features here, these functions, are what are going to be accessible by that component. So we're going to allow access to fetch data. We want it potentially to be able to access the data in data CRUD. The error. So we want it to potentially be able to access the error, and then potentially, well, not potentially, also is loading. So there are 4 kind of resources here that we're passing back. Now we need to just quickly define is loading. That's just going to be a Boolean, is loading. So let's define it here in our interface. Boolean. There we go. So that potentially is also going to be passed back. So we now have access to all these different resources. We'll have access to those resources within our component that utilizes this hook. So just zooming out here, I can see that we've still got a problem in that we're not using API URL for some particular reason. And the problem being that we need to make sure that we're using backticks here on line 21, not these singles. So backticks are needed there, and that just resolves any problems with that. So we should now have a functional hook that we can utilize anytime we make a request to retrieve or return or read data from the API. Remember, we're returning, or we're sending the API specific URL through the component. We're then going to send a request. We are utilizing the interceptor as part of that request mechanic or workflow. Remember that we're doing that. So we do have some different handling of data depending on the error responses with inside our interceptor at the moment. But we're also handling errors now, or passing error messages back to the component so it can then deal with that individually.